We have on the line Stanley Johnson, former MEP and, of course, father of Boris Johnson. And Bertie Ahern's take there, Stanley, was that if you look back to the sort of the root cause of how we ended up where we're at from a Conservative perspective, to some extent it was Boris's oven-ready deal blowing up in his face. Do you accept that?
Well, I think what was very interesting was Mr. Ahern's pointing out that actually when Boris came in, the total vote share of the Conservative Party, I believe the figure he just used, was it not over 50%?
That was me. Yeah, that was in April of 2020. The polling had the Conservatives at 51% following a high 40s or mid 40s election.
Yes, exactly. So that's the really point I'm really trying to make. I mean, what we saw last night was, yes, Labour got this very, very high number of seats, but I don't think you could say that Labour got the endorsement in terms of the proportion of the voting population that really Boris got in 2019.
Well, can I ask you on that basis, Stanley? I mean, we've seen in the States now things that could never have been countenanced before, where a one-term president decides he's going to have another shot at it and becomes the leading candidate. At the same time, there must be a lot of people saying, well, the only person who was able to hold reform and that reform vote at bay was Boris. Boris gave us one of our best election results in recent memory. We're now dwindling. Will he have another shot?
Well, I'm not Boris.
But you're close to him and have his ear, Stanley.
No, but I'm telling you the truth. I very much agree with the analysis you just made. I mean, if whatever way you look at it, Labour's vote last night was, I think, 33.8% or something like that. It was hardly up from the 32.2% of 2019. So if you look back, I think you have to say that what Starmer has just achieved is not the same kind of endorsement in real terms that Boris got in 2019. Now you go on.
But steady, Sandy. Let us be fair, though. We have to compare apples and apples, because whatever about Boris's 2019, by the point of his departure, the Conservatives were in a very different place, lagging Labour by 10%, and his successor then made a complete pig's ear out of it. But Boris did not leave the Conservative Party in a healthy place electorally.
Well, I think you have to say various other things intervened, which were not necessarily, as it were, to be laid at his door. And I think you might agree that COVID was a surprise. COVID came, as I recall, March 2020. The election of 2019 had just been in December. So you could argue, if you were a historian, that to get knocked so hard, so quickly in your term of office was a piece of bad luck.
Yes, but there again, you could cite a lot of
possible.
Western examples of governments which weathered an identical storm without losing 10 points to their opposition party. So I'm
Yeah,
sure a lot of historians would question his handling of it rather than the disease itself.
yeah. Well, I think you're right, but there was a lot of ignorance out there too. Looking back on it, you could say putting that 400 million, I beg your pardon, 400 billion pounds into fighting COVID without actually necessarily making much dent on the excess deaths chart. Well, was that money well spent? And I think the analysis which is going on may actually show that. The only problem is that analysis will take so long that people have forgotten what they're analyzing. Well, there we go. It's been an extraordinary night, and thank you very much for having me on. From my point of view, I don't know whether you noticed, though it was reported here, I actually voted Lib Dem.
I was going to ask you if you went through with your Lib Dem vote.
Well, I did. Indeed, I did, because 4 months ago, I said to Camilla Tominey, who is a very respected journalist, and she writes for the Sunday Times, but she also has a show on something called GB News, and she asked me, and I said, well, I'm going to think about voting for any political party which really puts a big emphasis on rebuilding the bridges between the United Kingdom and Europe on the one hand, and also really has a serious environmental program. And of course, the two are linked because I argued very strongly that Britain ought to be going back into the European Environment Agency, which is already open to non-EU countries. In fact, I wrote the rules to the agency when I was back in Europe. So yes, I did follow through on what I said I was going to do. I was impressed by the candidate in my London constituency. I also have a farm in the west of England, but I didn't vote there. By the way, you go to prison in this country if you vote twice. Did you know that? You do indeed, and so I certainly didn't vote twice, but I did vote for the Lib Dems in this constituency. Now, there's another point I'd like to make.
Well, briefly, if you would, Stanley. And
Yes,
by the way,
very
congratulations
very
then on a good
briefly.
election result for your party.
Well, very briefly. If more people, if more Conservatives have said, look, what we need to do is to hit Labour, and the way to hit Labour is by supporting Lib Dems, we might have knocked quite a lot out of that Labour majority. So I don't feel guilty at all about casting my votes for the Lib Dem this time round.
Stanley, thank you very much. That is Stanley Johnson, former MEP, environmental campaigner, and of course, father to Boris Johnson. Back after this break.